All right, we're back. So this is the second panel, and as I mentioned before we went on break, this panel will focus more on the current legal and aspects of it and the property restitution, transitional justice. So it's less historical, more current, and more legalistic, more property-oriented. And again, same thing that I did with the first panel. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves more or less, whatever they'd like to say. That way we cut back on time. So Kate's going first, or? Okay. So up first is Dr. Tania Mastrapa. She is a research professor here at the Institute of World Politics. And without further ado, Dr. Mastrapa.
Welcome. Thank you for coming out on this chilly Saturday. So the title of my presentation contains the term transitional justice. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this field. Maybe a show of hands if you've ever heard of it. So not too many. It's relatively new. Essentially, it's basically righting the wrongs of the past. What do you do when you had a bad regime? How do you fix that when that regime is gone? I don't put a statute of limitations on bad regimes. Higher? I don't put a statute of limitations on bad regimes. It's been a century. Nothing has been addressed, not thoroughly, certainly. So when we discuss the Armenian Genocide, particularly the massive property confiscation that went hand in glove with the deportations and the murder, I still think there's time for something to be done and resolved for the descendants of the survivors. So property confiscation has its common themes no matter who's doing it. The terminology will often be similar. You'll hear the same from communist regimes as you do from the Young Turks. It targets specific groups of people, whether they are political, socioeconomic, or ethnic groups that the regime wants removed altogether. There's always underlying animosity and a very common sentiment, envy. You will find this constantly. The belief that if you have done well, it is because you have taken it from someone else. And so, as opposed to saying, let's emulate this group of people who is so successful, we're just going to take them away so that there will be no competition and it will all be ours. A very interesting quote, which I think encompasses this sentiment. It's a British diplomat wrote his memoirs about his time in Turkey, and he commented this discussion he had with a Turkish businessman. And the businessman said, "All Christians, big and small, like making money. We Turks don't know how to make money. We only know how to take it. You want to introduce a system in which Christians will be able to squeeze all the money out of us and our country and keep it. Who profit by all these concessions for railways, harbors, and quays? Franks, Jews, Greeks, and Armenians, but never a Muslim. Do you remember that railway I helped you to build from Durograd to Maropolis? Franks travel by it, Greeks and Armenians sell the tickets, and in the end, all the money goes to the Jews. But what Turk wants a railway, and how much has any Turk made out of it?" So the underlying sentiment that you are an outsider on our turf and you are better off than we, why is that? The envy was and perhaps is so all-consuming that there's Turkish officials who would travel throughout and be in shock and complain, really, that the Turks were given money all the time for their schools and their projects, and yet they were described as dirty. Students didn't do well, they didn't even speak Turkish very well. The Armenians were denied a lot of assistance, of course. So what they did is just raise the money amongst themselves. They had great schools. And some of these officials said, why do Armenians speak Turkish and write Turkish better than we do? And so it was seen as an injustice. Never, let's see this model. What is it that they're doing? And try to catch up. and then we can all work together. So some of the terminology that you'll hear, again, to start justifying deportations, arrests, executions, that the competing group that wants the regime or the tyrant, whoever, wants removed, claims that they're enemy collaborators, that they've unjustly enriched themselves. Another term you'll hear a lot, particularly with properties, and communists always do this, they claim that the victims abandoned their properties, as though we just packed our bags and went on vacation in the meantime while this regime is in place. Obviously, you don't just abandon your property if people are being deported, executed, and arrested. You flee. It's a very big difference. But this is terminology that's used to justify not compensating. It says, you left it, it's ours. And frankly, some of the best evidence that you can see that these targets are not unfairly successful is when you see the success they enjoy after having all their property taken, all their family executed. They go abroad, they go to a country where they don't speak the language, and they do well again. So it had nothing to do with special treatment or favors or scamming anyone. It's just certain groups are better than others in commerce, in farming, and in all sorts of sectors. And you can see this obviously with Armenians. You can see it with Cubans. You can see it with Portuguese, who under their Marxist regime, the regime claimed that it's just, the main families that own everything and they steal everything. Well, when they fled, they did well everywhere they went again. So, it just proves it's the way they approach their businesses, education, family, why they do well. Another quote that's interesting from a Turkish official in the early 1900s said, "The Christian population of Turkey has been consistently progressing, partly by means of privileges too easily granted, and partly by their own initiative, and they are ousting the real owner of the country." This is the sort of mentality that starts being promoted, making people feel you don't own your own country, foreigners do. And so when you hear the stories of how neighbors and so-called friends helped in the killings because they were promised their property of whoever they helped eliminate, it's quite striking to think that you would do that to someone you've known all your life. But when you couple that with this idea of, this guy doesn't belong here, he's not one of us, why does he have more than I do? In groups, it's amazing how people just forget any kind of decency or form of friendship. So, again, these groups are often seen as threats. In this particular situation, commercial classes were dominated by Armenians and Greeks. Some people wonder, why would anyone target peasants? By peasants, I don't mean cultural peasants, I mean country people. And a large portion of the deportees were peasants. Well, the reason this is a threat to a so-called modernizing regime or anything else is because country people tend to maintain their traditions, large families. They're often fairly independent from the government because they have their farms and their cattle. They can live off their land, basically. And often they're armed to protect their property. So this is always a threat because it's not an uncontrollable group, but certainly one that doesn't need the government to hand out anything. Another group that is a main competitor to tyrant is the church. So particularly in these instances where Eastern Christians religions are intrinsically linked to biology, nationality. You don't separate Armenian from Armenian Apostolic or Greek from Greek Orthodox. So churches provide schooling, orphanages, hospitals, and they save souls, and never at the expense of the government. So anytime you have a group that can do something away from the government, they're a threat, and they need to take everything away, including churches. So Christian churches were turned into warehouses and They stored cattle and horses. The idea being, let's disrespect this as much as possible. And that way, we're disrespecting your religion and you as a people. And today, they're largely destroyed, unfortunately. Things are shaping up though, right, Rafi? So something that I had mentioned that must happen when you are confiscating property, you must confiscate arms. Why? You take away their self-defense. And so you will always hear this idea propagated, like, oh, no one defended themselves, so they must not have cared. Well, you don't have anything with which to defend yourself if it's all been taken. And this is very methodical. This isn't just random legislation that takes place. Then you have to create a legal framework for all your misdeeds to justify them. And then, of course, they always break their own laws. So I won't go into the legislation because I could be here for 2 weeks describing every decree justifying taking property from Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, Jews. Again, you will always, confiscation of property is not simply an abuse of eminent domain in these cases. This is always coupled with deportation, exile, arrest, murder. It's a way of eliminating your identity. You're so identified with what you own that taking that away from you, naturally it takes away your source of income, but they start removing the names of your businesses, your historical properties, and so after a while it's as though you never existed. And then of course the final method is physically eliminating you. The last theme is the distribution of what is often called recovered wealth and property, the implication being you had taken it from us and now it's ours. And then generally you have these properties settled or granted for having been loyal to the people, the new regime. Businesses are often given to people who have no skills, and which is why you see they won't be successful afterwards. And this is also a topic that is used to deny compensation or restitution later, because you will hear the discussion that there's an occupant on that property, you cannot remove them. So the original victim of the confiscation becomes the evil guy, because he wants to kick out this poor person who simply was given your house or your business or your farm. So although it's been 100 years, like I said, I don't think there's a statute of limitations. Oftentimes the difficulty is proving your claims. How do you prove what you owned? There is rich literature on this, fortunately. So there are detailed records of confiscations that are inaccessible because the Turkish government deems them a national security threat. If you allow those archives to be opened, the massive amount of claims that would take place, Turkey would be over. I mean, there's no survival if every Armenian got their property back, and that's why they're deemed a threat. This is why Turkey can manipulate world politics, because it's allied itself with the right people. And so while you have something as indisputable as a genocide, even the United States won't officially recognize it because we don't want to offend Turkey. Other ways to prove claims: activists like Mr. Bedrosian, scholars and foundations have compiled records of property ownership. All of this is extremely valuable to provide evidence were this to ever move forward. Oral history passed on to survivors, descendants. And also journalists and diplomats wrote accounts of the events. All of this is available. So my theme is transitional justice. What are the scenarios that could take place were this regime to go away? A very conservative scenario for addressing property confiscation would be monetary compensation, and this can be a mixed bag of cash payments or bonds, sale of state property, or privatization of state properties. And you need to keep in mind, no matter what solution you find, everyone is not going to be happy. It's impossible. A more moderate scenario is the restitution or the actual return of the original property or the provision of a comparable property. Again, this is where you will run into, there's someone lives there. How could you throw them on the streets? The person who was granted your family's property is the victim now, not you. This restitution also tends to be less expensive. You're not taxing anyone. But of course, if Armenians start going into these areas and start owning everything again, what happens to Turkey? And then, of course, an extreme scenario, this is unlikely, but it would be a physical recovery of ancestral lands by military force or whatever action. You know, Russia's done a little bit of this lately. So I don't know if Armenians would have any support in taking back lands. I think that is obviously most unlikely. So you'll always have roadblocks to getting compensation or your property back. Number one roadblock, the current Turkish government. It's clear they would not want Armenians to have their property back, not the Greeks, not the Assyrians, not anyone. The property occupants that I mentioned, they will fight that they're going to be displaced because of these greedy people that want their property back. Another key one that isn't mentioned often, foreign investors. This is a big issue in communist countries. You know the property was confiscated from someone who was probably arrested or executed or deported. You're supposed to do your research when you invest in a property. And even the United States government is on confiscated Armenian property. So I think the likelihood of the US government promoting restitution or anything for Armenians is slim to none. I believe the Hilton Hotel is on some properties that were confiscated in Istanbul. These become endless legal battles for who has the right to the property. And lastly, foreign governments. As long as Turkey is a part of NATO, it would probably be seen as very destabilizing to spend these exorbitant amounts of money, calculated to be in the trillions, for confiscation of for compensation payments for these confiscated properties. So, essentially, any future Turkish government that wants to work towards earnest democracy has to address all the wrongs of the past. And if this is ever the case, what generally tends to happen, unfortunately, is you have very public returns of some properties that portrays an image that real reform is taking place. And most of the claims get swept under the carpet. Restitution legislation that is created sounds nice, but it's often created with all kinds of roadblocks for any recovery or payment. Something typical is if the property has not changed since it was taken, then you can have it back. Well, what's the likelihood it hasn't changed in 100 years? And so, while I think this should continue to be pressed, I wouldn't hope for great support from the US government, but perhaps individual politicians and such. As long as Turkey remains in NATO, I don't know how much will be pushed. They haven't helped. They're letting ISIS train. So perhaps this relationship will start to crumble, and then Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians can move forward and take advantage of that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mastrapa, and again, research professor here, and I failed to mention earlier, Mastrapa Consultants, which Dr. Mastrapa founded, deals with these issues, and Mastrapa Consultants, along with PDRC, is a co-organizer of this event. So thank you for that presentation. I particularly liked your scenarios. Maybe we can game those out further for another event. Now we move on to Kate Nahapetian. She is the Government Affairs, right? Director. with the Armenian National Committee of America, and she'll be talking about a similar theme, but more from a legal aspect in international law. So, please, Kate.
Thank you very much for inviting me here to present. I'm going to be focusing on international law, reparations, and the defenses that we're likely to see from the Turkish state. First, I will address, well, just a little bit more. I am the Government Affairs Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, representing Armenian American interests here in Washington, D.C., before Congress and the executive branch. I have worked as a class action attorney, a human rights and civil rights defender at nonprofits and the Department of Justice, and on foreign policy issues in the Senate and at the Carnegie Endowment for National Peace. But let me start out with, were reparations envisioned at the time that the genocide was committed? People understand that genocide is a crime today, reparations are due today, but what was it like in 1915 when these crimes were being committed? And then the likely defenses we're going to see from Turkey, which are the Lausanne Treaty extinguished any claims, the Kars Treaty determined the border between Turkey and Armenia, it's finished, the statute of limitations, time has gone by, and the protocols that were signed between Armenia and Turkey in October of 2009 is also likely going to be used. The Armenian Genocide was indeed a crime under international law at the time. Although many attempt to frame the unresolved nature of the genocide as a bilateral conflict between solely Armenia and Turkey, it was a crime against humanity that created obligations on all states to confront it. In the immediate aftermath of the genocide, the international community repeatedly stated that reparations were in order. For instance, U.S. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby wrote to the French ambassador on March 24, 1920, quote, "The government of the United States is convinced that the civilized world demands that Armenia must be so defined as to satisfy all the legitimate claims of her people, and particularly she must receive a free access to the sea, an indispensable condition to her existence." International law required reparations at the time for genocide as well, or for international violations in general. The well-known Chorzów factory case between Germany and Poland for property stolen in 1922 firmly established by an international court that, quote, "It is a principle of international law that the breach of an engagement involved an obligation to make reparations in adequate form." At the time of the Armenian Genocide, the international community also believed that it was a crime and that reparations were due. They were outlined in the Treaty of Sèvres. This was a treaty that was signed by an independent Armenia and the Ottoman Empire in 1920, along with France, Allied powers. The Treaty of Sèvres had provisions for restitution of properties and land reparations. Article 144 stated that all properties should be returned without compensation to the current owners, and irrespective if other people were living on that property. So they knew that there were other people living on the properties, but they envisioned that they did not have a right to compensation at that time, and these properties should be returned, even if they had been transferred to third parties. They envisioned an arbitral commission to be formed, appointed by the League of Nations, with one representative from the Ottoman Empire, one representative from minority groups, not just Armenians, and one representative from the League of Nations. And they even envisioned the fact that because of the mass murder, that there were going to be people where there was not even going to be a single heir left for that property to be returned to. But they had a provision in the Treaty of Sèvres that if that was the case, the property should then be returned to the community at large, to community organizations. And Article 89 of the Treaty of Sèvres called for the border between Armenia Armenia and the Ottoman Empire to be drawn by the President of the United States, Wilson at the time, and Wilson agreed to be the arbitrator of this border. Both the Ottoman Empire and Armenia, when they signed this, relinquished any right to object to this arbitral award. They said, okay, we agree that President Wilson's going to be the final arbitrator of this award, and we're not going to protest it once it's awarded. The Department of State created a commission to determine this border. They traveled to the region, they studied the region, they studied the ethnicities of the people who were living there at the time, and before they drew the border. President Wilson signed this arbitral award. And it granted Armenia access to the sea. The issue is the Treaty of Sèvres was not ratified. But it is a crucial treaty documenting the fact that the international community considered what happened to the Armenians a crime, that they envisioned reparations. What many people believe is that the Lausanne Treaty supposedly superseded the Sèvres Treaty. And the Lausanne Treaty did determine the borders between Turkey and several of its neighbors, but it specifically did not address the border between the Ottoman Empire and Armenia. Armenia was not a signatory to the Lausanne Treaty. You can't be bound by a treaty that you weren't a signatory to. They were part of the Soviet Union at the time, and the Soviet Union was not a party to the Lausanne Treaty either. So Armenia can't be bound by Lausanne Treaty because of the Soviet Union either. You can't make that argument. The other issue is, if Turkey wants to use the Lausanne Treaty to extinguish Armenian claims on some other issues, it first has to abide by it. The Vienna Convention on the Laws of Treaties established that if you want to enforce certain provisions of a treaty, you have to abide by all of them. You can't pick and choose. And one of the provisions of the Lausanne Treaty is that Turkey will not discriminate against any of its minorities, that it will give equal rights to all its citizens, irrespective of their religion. Turkey doesn't even do that today. Right after the genocide, they clearly didn't. They were, in the 1940s, they were taxing Armenians, Jews, Greeks, a special higher tax. That's how explicit the discrimination was after the Lausanne Treaty. So they clearly are violating it. Today, minorities are also discriminated in Turkey. Another defense will be the Kars Treaty. Now this determined the border between the Soviet Union and Turkey. Armenia, it was signed in 1921, and some arguments against the Kars Treaty are, first of all, that Armenia was a captured nation at this time. They were not an independent nation as they were when the Treaty of Sèvres was signed. Second, again, the same issue, the Vienna Convention of Laws of Treaties said, if you're going to try to enforce a particular treaty, you have to abide by it. And the Kars Treaty explicitly states that the border will be open. There should not be a blockade. So by blockading Armenia, Turkey is violating the Kars Treaty. They're undermining the most important treaty for them by blockading Armenia. So they can't enforce just some provisions they like about the Kars Treaty and not others. Articles 7 and 8 of the Kars Treaty oblige parties to ensure that the borders are open. For over 20 years, Turkey has been blockading landlocked Armenia. It's one of the longest lasting blockades in modern history. And when it comes to being bound by treaties that the Soviet Union signed at the time, for instance, there's other former Soviet republics like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan who also say that they're not bound by certain treaties that the Soviet Union signed. For instance, the Soviet Union signed treaties with Iran determining which gas fields in the Caspian were Iran's and which were the Soviet Union's. To this day, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan say that they're not bound by those Soviet treaties because they were captured nations as well. So this is not something unique to Armenia. Another argument that a human rights lawyer, Alfred de Zayas, has made is that the Vienna Convention of Treaties, Article 64, says that even if a treaty was valid at the time, if it violates a jus cogens notion, such as genocide is one of them, that treaty will be invalidated because it is counter to such an important human right, for instance. So one could argue that the Karj Treaty should be invalidated because it came about through a genocide. Armenia was so weak because of the genocide, it wouldn't have happened without it. Another treaty that I want to touch upon that's very interesting to American history is that the Americans were not signatories to the Lausanne Treaty. But there is another treaty that the US signed with Turkey called the American Lausanne Treaty. And this was supposed to establish US-Turkey relations after World War I. And it's indicative to show how the Sèvres Treaty still was viewed, even after Lausanne Treaty had been signed, the Sèvres Treaty in the American conscience was viewed very much as valid still. Because the US Senate refused to ratify this treaty between the United States and Turkey. One of the major reasons the US Senate refused to ratify this treaty in 1927, after the Lausanne Treaty had been signed, was because of the Armenian Genocide, was because of Wilson's award to the Armenians. The Democratic Platform from 1924 condemned this treaty that the US was trying to get ratified by the Senate to establish relations with Turkey. The Democratic Platform explained that their opposition to the treaty was because, quote, it barters legitimate rights and betrays Armenia. We favor the protection of American rights in Turkey and the fulfillment of President Wilson's arbitral award respecting Armenia. Despite the administration's years of lobbying the US Senate to ratify this treaty, it was defeated. A senator from Utah, William King, said the obvious reason for the defeat was, it would be unfair and unreasonable for the US to recognize and respect the claim and profession of Mustafa Kemal Pasha so long as he persists in holding control and sovereignty over Wilson's Armenia, while nearly 1 million Armenian refugees and exiles are people without a country. The other issue I want to address is the statute of limitations. Now, there is a convention on the non-applicability of statutory limitations for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, what happened in the Armenian Genocide was clearly a crime against humanity. Actually, the first time that term, crime against humanity, was used by international state actors was to describe what was happening to the Armenians. This convention, however, came into force in 1970. So Armenia and Azerbaijan are signatories to this convention. Turkey is not, the United States is not, France and the UK are not, but there are still people who argue that even if you're not a signatory to this treaty, because it is considered customary international law, that you still should be bound by it. You can see in domestic law, you can see this concept used. For instance, when it comes to murder, there's no statute of limitations in the United States for murder. But another, I'd like to touch on Turkey itself, believes that reparations for historic wrongs are in order and that statute of limitations should not extinguish these claims when it comes to their properties. For instance, in Turkey's quest to acquire antiquities from museums in Europe that were taken decades ago, Turkey has stated that the passing of time cannot be an excuse for paying reparations. Turkey's Director Consul of Cultural Heritage and Museums, Murat Suslu, asked in September 2012, quote, if you come to my house and you steal precious objects from me, do I not have a right to get them back? Turkey's cultural minister, Etgul Güney, says that looting is wrong no matter when it has occurred, stating, quote, artifacts, just like people, have souls and historical memories. When they are repatriated to their countries, the balance of nature will be restored. When we're dealing with this statute of limitations issue also, it's noteworthy to note that East Germany did not pay reparations for the Holocaust until the 1990s, despite repeated efforts from the Jewish diaspora to get reparations. They failed for decades, but it was not until the 1990s that they did eventually pay reparations. There's a concept when you're dealing with statute of limitations in courts of tolling the statute of limitations when the defendant has been acting in bad faith and has been hiding the wrong, for instance, or, and Dr. Stanton has described in his presentation how Turkey has been purging the archives of the documentary evidence. We've also heard when Armenians, non-Armenians, have actually just gone near graves. They've been arrested in the 1960s. Armenians, to this day, there are certain villages in Turkey where if you go there within minutes, the police will come. And if you even just talk about the crime in Turkey, you can be prosecuted. So these are all efforts to cover up the crime that I would argue should be used to toll the statute of limitations. When you have a Turkey that threatens the Armenians in Turkey today with bodily harm if you just merely talk about the Armenian Genocide, and in the case of 2007, they actually threatened what we heard from congressional sources, that they would allow American soldiers to bleed to death in Iraq if we pass the Armenian Genocide resolution. When you have a Turkey acting in this way, I would argue that you have to toll the statute of limitations. Another argument to confront the statute of limitations claim would be that there's some human rights lawyers who say that it hasn't even started to run, and as Dr. Stanton said, because denial is part of genocide. So the genocide has not ended. The murder has stopped, but the denial of it continues to this day. So the statute of limitations hasn't even started. Now, there's the argument that Turkey will make is that Armenia has waived their claims. They've sat on them for too long. Well, first of all, Armenia was a captured nation under the Soviet Union until the 1990s. But have they started waiving the claims since the 1990s? Armenia's Declaration of Independence in the preamble says, quote, aware of its historic responsibility for the destiny of the Armenian people engaged in the realization of the aspirations of all Armenians and the restoration of, quote, historical justice. So the Declaration of Independence views the need for historical justice as part of the Armenian nation. And Article 11 says the Republic of Armenia stands in support of the task of achieving international recognition of the 1915 genocide in Ottoman Turkey and Western Armenia, is what it says. Did the protocols between Armenia and Turkey extinguish Armenia's claims? Well, Turkey lobbied extensively for Armenia to explicitly recognize the Kars Treaty. Armenia did not in the protocols that were signed in 2009. What they did recognize was, quote, the existing border between the two countries as defined by the relevant treaties of international law. Now, the fact that Armenia blockaded, landlocked, at war with its neighbor in Azerbaijan, with soldiers dying to this day, had the strength to refuse to recognize the Kars Treaty explicitly and talk about relevant treaties. Now, what does that mean? I would argue shows that Armenia is maintaining its claim. It has not extinguished it, is actively trying to assert it. The Constitutional Court decision also part of Armenia's system requires that the protocols had to be reviewed by the Constitutional Court to deem it constitutional before it was ratified by the Parliament. And the Constitutional Court said that it was constitutional because it did not undermine the Declaration of Independence, which included those articles talking about historical justice for the Armenian Genocide. And the court ruled also that only those international treaties that have been ratified under the constitution of the present Republic of Armenia could be considered legally valid. So you could say here that Armenia would say, because the Kars Treaty was not ratified by the present Republic of Armenia, Armenia does not view it as a valid treaty. And I just wanted to also mention that there are plenty of examples of historic wrongs being righted or after decades have passed. Canada and Australia have been returning lands to Native American populations, and New Zealand as well. The Japanese Americans received compensation for internment decades after World War II. France and Russia resolved claims dating back to 1917, several decades later in the 1990s, and again the East German example for the Holocaust. So one of the main requirements, though, in all these examples is a party that is willing to come to the table, willing to recognize that wrongs were committed and wanting to right them. And that's where it's so important. What we're seeing in Turkey today, more and more Turks are speaking, risking their lives, and talking about the genocide and also talking about reparations. These are Turks who are not Armenians. There was even a conference on reparations in Ankara a few years ago in Turkey. So, and this April 24th, again, after several, it's been several years that they've been commemorating the genocide in Istanbul. That's going to happen again this year. Every year they're getting bigger. And you have now the grandson of one of the masterminds of the Armenian genocide, Cemal Pasha's grandson, Hasan Cemal, who has written a book about the Armenian genocide even. So decades of outside pressure are making a difference in Turkey. And they have to be continued. Over the past several years, the Armenian genocide, like I said, is being commemorated in Turkey and no longer just in Istanbul. The discussion for reparations has also begun in Turkey. Again, the Armenian genocide was a criminal act not only against the Armenian people, but humanity. The world community's failure to work towards a just resolution continues to fuel the instability that we see in the region today. The lasting impact of the genocide in Turkey, where Armenians continue to be persecuted, and where the country that Turkey's predecessor state tried to annihilate is being blockaded by Turkey today, shows that repeated efforts to, quote, reconcile, create dialogue between Armenia and Turkey is not working. It is time for the international community to honor its commitment to prevent and punish genocide and work towards a just resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate Nahapetian, ANCA Government Affairs Director. So we have time for Q&A, and then lunch will be served, which I'm sure you're all excited about. So let's try to limit it to 3, no more than 4 questions. Dr. Stanton?
I had a really wonderful question after my presentation from Ms. Karpouyan here. Okay. She asked, well, why is there no action legally, to obtain reparations? And being an international lawyer, I said, well, one of the biggest problems that we face is there aren't courts that have jurisdiction. And so she said, well, how do you create that jurisdiction? Well, here in the United States, the Congress has plenary power to create jurisdiction over these kinds of things. And so Congress, of course, isn't even recognizing the Armenian genocide at this point, so we've got a few ways to go on this. But if it did, it could also create jurisdiction in U.S. courts for reparations claims. And I think that might be really problematic with our foreign relations with Turkey. But it would be also something that you could do with other countries. I mean, European countries might be willing to grant jurisdiction to their courts. It's just a question I have because your masterful presentation, Kate, and yours, Tania, I mean, it really set up the case, I thought. Anyway, I just wanted to get your response.
There have been cases in the U.S. courts for life insurance claims, and there is one case right now pending before the Turkish state. But when it comes, in the cases of reparations that I outlined, and including the Holocaust, every one of them was determined through a political process,
Yes.
not through a legal process.
Right.
So I think that's the way that the Armenian case will also be resolved, is through a political process between Armenia, Turkey, and the diaspora. And the protocols seem to envision that, creating subcommissions to determine historical problems. The problem with that is that language was so vague that Turkey was saying, well, that's going to determine whether there was genocide or not. And that's a clear red line. Because there have been lots of commissions to look at the genocide. There's been decades of history. Every time it's been determined that it's a genocide, Turkey has just walked away from the process or said, oh, let's look at it from this angle or that angle. In the U.S. court system, there are so many obstacles for bringing a claim against a state. You don't even need Congress to enable it. It is possible. The issue is states have sovereign immunity, so we can't just sue states willy-nilly. But there are exceptions to sovereign immunity, and one of those exceptions is when genocide is committed. A state in the United States court will not be considered immune when they've committed genocide. So that's why these cases are pursuing. But I think it's better. I think the better angle would be to have a solution where all the parties are at the table, because that's how it's been done in every case.
Yes, Mr. Peterson.
Just to answer Dr. Stanton, the only way to sue Turkey now is individually within Turkish courts and lose in Turkish courts and then take it to European Court of Human Rights. That's the only way, and that's being pursued now, started the last 2 years. I had a question to both panelists. Both Dr. Mastrapa and Nahapetian referred to the abandoned properties and the Lausanne Treaty. The Lausanne Treaty did have clauses that Armenians will be allowed to return to Turkey to claim their properties. And then immediately after signing this, Turkey passed legislation that Armenians can only claim their property if they are on their own land within 6 months. And of course, then any surviving Armenian that wanted to return to Turkey, Turks prevented them from coming, and anybody who came in bribing border officials was jailed and kicked out again without being able to claim. My question to both of you is, the signing states of Lausanne Treaty, can they enforce the Lausanne Treaty by making Turkey take back these legislations which are counter to the Lausanne Treaty? I don't know.
I think they could bring it, but there's not the political will. And in the International Court of Justice, where that would be the venue to do it, only states can bring cases. Individuals can't. So even if you had a strong, like a united diasporan force, they can't bring a claim in the International Court of Justice. But maybe France could. I mean, that's someone that is most likely But that's where they would interpret that.
You alluded to this, and I think one of the main issues with property issues, especially as time passes, is the Pandora's box that you open up when you start allowing either a group or a company or an individual to make a claim, because then you find ways of claiming for frozen assets from that country, or you get it gets competitive, really. Someone from another country where this happened to them then says, well, why not us? And it creates madness, I think. And so Kate had mentioned even artworks that Turkey wants now. Well, things like movable property, these artworks, the very fact that they move makes them incredibly difficult to recover or find. But you start getting people who say, well, West Africa, it was under duress that these artifacts were taken by museums during colonial times. Well, when that starts getting accepted, then other groups start saying, well, me too. And museums become hysterical because suddenly they become empty. So I think, again, and we've both touched upon this, it becomes political, not legal, not moral, simply who has more sway. And I mentioned possibly Turkey won't have as much sway if they keep misbehaving the way they are now, and there will be some possibility for addressing this